Meanwhile, let me introduce myself. My name is Priya, and I'm one of the Sayo co-founders. And together with me, there's Arifa here and Lara. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Tamanna. I am Arifa. I am one of the co-founders of Sayo 2. I am based in India in Mumbai, and I am also a journalist. So that is also a perspective I can share during this presentation. Lara?
Hi, I am the communications assistant, and I'm based in Boston. And if throughout the chat you have, or throughout the webinar, you have any questions, I can respond to you in the chat box.
Okay, super. I'm going to start my screen share right now so that you can see our presentation. Oh, nice. It's good to
Yeah,
know.
that's great. Where are you based?
She's based out of Baroda.
Oh, that's great.
No. Is that right? Oh, super. Okay, so here we begin. We start presentation. Can you see my screen right now?
Yep.
Okay. So today's webinar is on the role of media in social change. And the people presenting are me, I'm a co-founder and also a filmmaker, and Arifa, who is, Arifa, you already...
I'm a journalist and a co-founder of.
Super. And there is Lara, who is going to be moderating our chats today. We came up with this idea of media training because we wanted to speak to the media about how media has shaped the movement on resistance on Khatna. And media has been a very strong player in speaking about this taboo subject, bringing it out to the people. But at the same time, it has a huge responsibility of speaking about this sensitive subject in a delicate, sensitive manner so that all the ethical considerations are kept in mind, which is why we thought it would be effective to speak to the media on what are the best practices that we as activists on the subject feel should be a good way to go about it. And this webinar would specifically focus on female genital cutting in Asian communities, specifically the Daudi Bohra community, and how to sensitively report on the subject. Okay, and the objective of this webinar is to talk about the best practices, exchange notes with the media, share some of the good examples and bad examples, and most importantly, ground the subject into ethical considerations before writing, speaking, blogging, or making a video on the subject. How can this webinar be useful? This webinar can be useful if you want to think about how one can serve the best interest of the survivors. Now, as a journalist, and Arifa can speak to you more about that. I understand that there's a need to put the story out there and do a kind of an expose of a practice which which is the case many times, but somewhere at the back end of it, there is a survivor who's reading the story, and how would she receive it? That is also something to be thought about. And then thinking about the survivor, thinking about how to mobilize an opinion, how can one write a holistic report which is non-sensational and yet manages to catch attention and create a critical mass of people who are willing to support the movement. This webinar can also be useful for you if you want to know what is it from an insider's perspective. And by an insider's perspective, we mean perspective as an activist, perspective as people who have undergone the trauma themselves. And this webinar can also be useful to you if you want to know about it a little bit in depth. Okay, but before understanding how media can be super powerful and helpful in driving the social change, RFI is going to tell us about how the media can be harmful.
Thank you, Priya. So yes, it is important while we totally focus on the positive role of the media and the role the media plays such an important role in shaping social change. But similarly, it can also play a role in causing harm, and we need to look at the ways in which that happens. So, if you look at this next slide, this is an example of a particular report that had come out in the Week magazine in India. And it was actually an interview of me as a survivor of female genital cutting and as as an activist working in the community. And this was actually a really uh, terrible report from my perspective, as as a survivor, as somebody who was interviewed. I can go into a lot of backstories about how this particular report really sensationalized and created like a very false uh, version of a false experience and pushed it out in a very sensational way. But one of the things that I want to focus on is, this cover photo. It uses the caption under the photo uses terms like brutal, criminal, regressive to describe the practice of female genital cutting that I went through. And these terms are really strong, harsh, judgmental terms that are very frequently used to describe FGC, because it is such a shocking practice for many people who come across it for the first time. And the tendency is to look at it as a sort of something that's so horrible that you need these strong terms to describe it. But what we don't realize is that for the community members reading it, it comes across as a very hostile attack on them, because that's not what they're intending to do to their children. They're not intending to be brutal or regressive or criminal. Also, as a survivor, it kind of it can trigger a lot of trauma in survivors. It can be really unpleasant. So that causes added stress to survivors who are reading this. And if you see in the next slide, the text of that same report opens with a quote from the book by Waris Diri. It's called Desert Flower. Waris Diri was a supermodel from Somalia who had undergone the practice of FGC, and she wrote a book about it. And the quote used right before my experience is described um, says, and I'm just reading out Waris Diri's quote. It says, "Mama tied a blindfold over my eyes. The next thing I felt was my flesh being cut away. I heard the blade sawing back and forth through my skin." And the very next paragraph talks about how that's Arifa Johari, survivor from Mumbai, um, how I can relate to this particular account of this Somali woman. And when I read that, it was a shock to me, because I absolutely cannot relate to this. This is an inaccurate account of it's an inaccurate representation of my experience. This is not at all how I experienced my khatna. And it was a shock to me. It was a shock to a lot of people who know me and who are reading this. So it ended up jeopardizing a lot of work that I do as an activist. It ended up also reducing my credibility as somebody who has experienced FGC, because I came across, even though it was the magazine that was doing it, I come across as somebody sensationalizing my experience. So that's another. It's such a sensationalist representation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember at this point that when the article came out, it was the cover story. Am I right, Arifa? On the magazine stands. and imagine being on the cover story. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, even the cover story of that particular article, the cover page had a picture of, a part of my face, and it labeled me as a victim of FGM. And this was despite the fact that I had clearly told the reporter that I wish to be identified as a survivor and not a victim. And that we will be talking later about terminology, but these words make a difference. And it also shows the insensitivity that journalists can sometimes have, and editors and reporters can sometimes have towards the uh, very people whose stories they're using to sell their report. Um, and yeah, moving to the next slide. This is a mixture of both a visual representation as well as uh, a headline that is problematic. So the headline says sliced and scarred, and that again is something that uh, is very negative, very sensationalist. And the photo, we'll be again talking more about visuals, but the photo shows a scissor cutting womanhood, the symbol of womanhood. So that too can be a problem. Um, and the next couple of slides, and maybe I can play this video. This was a video interview that a French publication had done with another of Sayo's co-founders called Maria Tahir. And Maria also belongs to the Bora community, the Daudi Bora community. But if you see the opening parts of this video, which we're just going to play shortly, just a little bit, the opening visuals show somebody from Indonesia being cut. Then it cuts to visuals from an African community, and then it cuts to Maria talking about her experience, as if it's homogenizing all of these different experiences, as if they're all the same, same community, as if they're all this, the same type of experience. But there's so many different types of genital cutting, and it affects different women in different ways. So while yes, they are all forms of the same practice, it's still not the same practice, it's still not the same experience. And when you generalize and when you kind of conflate all of these different communities, it just adds to more misunderstanding. um, Priya, do you want to play a bit of the video?
Yeah, sure. Okay, I hope you're still able to hear and see the screen. Tamanna, here it is, the video.
I remember crying because something sharp cut me. I remember my mother comforting me afterwards, and the women actually gave me a Coke afterwards to make me feel better too. My family used to go back to India every other summer.
Is that it, Arifa? You want me to play more?
Yeah, I think this is a good illustration of what I was trying to talk about, which is that even it's not just about the visuals, even the sound effect. It kind of the way the scenes just cut from one to the other. It just indicated, ended up unwittingly perhaps indicated that these are all the same experience, as if the visuals were a representation of Maria's experience, which they weren't. And I'm going to pass this on back to Priya, who's going to talk about what is at stake when the media tends to misrepresent or poorly represent female genital cutting.
Thank you, Arifa. Yes, I mean, it is also a very for a lack of better word, it might be an absolutely traumatizing experience to see yourself misrepresented, especially when you are being represented on a subject which is already such a difficult subject to talk about, is a existing taboo already. So I think the biggest thing at stake here is that the survivor's interest and the ethical responsibility that as a journalist that the journalist would carry while reporting on a subject like this. So what actually makes for a bad report or a badly written report? The first thing, of course, is a lot can be done through the language. When the community reads words like barbaric, cruel, insidious, shameless, brutal, gruesome about themselves, or words like backward, insensitive, tribal, automatically the community would feel defensive and being attacked. And more importantly, this is going to promote an us versus them divide, where the community would feel that it is being targeted by somebody who's not from the community. And the community would also feel being labeled as, who wants to be labeled as backward, insensitive, or tribal. So those are the things to keep in mind while speaking about the practice and while associating a whole community with the practice and using words like this. But then how else can this be addressed? Maybe it is important to foreground that this is gender-based violence. This is a tradition which is a harmful tradition for women and girls, and it continues to exist as a tradition. And imagine talking about the community and the practice, and in doing so, using A, harsh words, B, strong visuals like blade, blood, knife, scissors. As activists working on this, very often we come across all sorts of visuals, and more often than not, those visuals are aimed at shocking the audience and immediately, eliciting a response, shock response from them. So this is one example, as you can see, of a visual which is so graphic and has blood. And to top it all, the article described practice as barbaric, ruthless, cruel, so on and so forth. So we've already, both Arifa and I have spoken a little bit about what makes for a bad report, which is excessive use of harsh words, excessive use of graphic visuals. Let's move out of examples of FGC for a second, and let's look at what's been done in some other challenging areas. I'm going to talk about two such examples, successful examples, which took place in America a few decades back. One was when scientists started to discover that the ozone layer is being threatened by different household appliances and goods that we used. It was a huge communication challenge to convey to the public to stop using maybe their refrigerator, the kind of refrigerator they were using, or for that matter, the deodorant they were using. So they came up with the terminology of ozone hole. And this example is relevant as to how a catchphrase or the right wording in a difficult situation or a problem which needs a solution can catch the attention and also be a call to action. And it can be a call to action in a way which says that we are all in this problem together. For example, when the term ozone hole was coined, the phrase was coined, it immediately moved people into action. It foregrounded the urgency of the situation. It foregrounded the urgency strongly enough to compel people to leave their old style refrigerators and make way for new invention. Another good example of terminologies and catchphrases being effective is when several decades back, America, in the US, there was a rise of the phrase mental health instead of mental illness. Now, it comes as no surprise. There's a great deal of taboo when it comes to anything to do with the mental health. And it continues to be a taboo even today, where in many countries, broaching up any kind of mental illness, you would be stigmatized or branded as being mad. Uh, and yet, there are better ways to phrase this and talk about this. And the media in the US did it successfully when they came up with the term mental health, taking the negative charge of mental illness away. So these two are examples to say that perhaps we need to look at catchphrases and visuals in a way where we can instantly sound like we are all in this together, and also sound like there is a call to action to it. Moving on, Arifa, do you want to talk about this?
Yes. So, in this segment, I want to talk about social norms. So, in Sayo's work, we have largely and repeatedly talked about how uh, female genital cutting is a social norm, and primarily we need to look at it as a social norm. Uh, so the question is, what is a social norm? It's a term that's used in sociology to describe a certain tradition or a ritual or a belief or a practice that the community in question has just been doing for ages, probably centuries, or basically a norm that has been something that has been normalized, something that's just expected behavior in the community, that everyone is just supposed to do it. And these kinds of norms are perpetuated because of that expectation, because everyone in the community expects you to do it. If you don't do it, there are consequences of not doing it. Either you will be boycotted, or it's just so deeply ingrained in your psyche that you just, it's just something you have to do without questioning. So one good example of a social norm would be menstrual taboos. So, especially in South Asian countries, people are really familiar with menstrual taboos, where you're not allowed to touch anything religious when you're on your period. You're not allowed to go to the temple or the mosque or whatever. You're not allowed to pray in a certain way. Um and in extreme forms, or you can't go in the house, or you can't touch the pickle. So all kinds of so all kinds of taboos exist around menstruation, and they're all social norms that people just keep on following generation after generation without questioning. um, so there are, I'm sure we can all think of many examples of social norms that are regressive, and that end up oppressing women or discriminating against a certain group of people. And that is what we're saying. That is exactly what um, khatna or female genital cutting is. And where does the media come into this? Uh, in our movement and in general, social norm theory believes that if you focus only on the negative aspect of a social norm, then you end up reinforcing that social norm. So that ties in with what we've been trying to say earlier, that when you focus on negative terms, like describing khatna as barbaric or horrific or brutal or whatever, you're focusing on all the negative aspects of it. It ends up making the community feel defensive, and they'll want to protect that social norm because they're feeling attacked. And what we need to do is we need to give equal balance to the change, to the aspect that the norm is changing. That we need to give equal attention to the fact that female genital cutting is ending, that the prevalence rates of this practice are declining, if we want to change the social norm. So our collective goal, even as journalists or any media professionals, when you are focusing on FGC, you're doing it from the perspective of wanting to wanting to bring attention to the practice, so that the eventual goal is you want to end the practice, and that is the goal. That is what we would say is, we want to change the social norm. We want people to no longer the current norm is that you should cut. We want to change the norm to say that you should not cut your daughters, and that's what everyone in the society should willingly want to believe in, so that more and more people in the community believe that it's not good to cut their daughters, and so the whole community will start doing it then. So to do that, we need the media also to focus on aspects of change, to highlight the fact that the norm is changing.
Yes.
And yeah, over to you, Priya.
And I agree. And it is such a tricky thing that as it is, this is a very taboo subject. And then somebody risks their position between in a community, their families, and then they come out to the media, and the media misrepresents them. So here, once again, one really needs to understand the full impact and import of somebody stepping out of a social norm, which Arifa explained how difficult and repetitive it can be, and how difficult it is to basically go against what you have been ingrained ever since childhood. So when a survivor is speaking out, she's actually speaking out against all odds, against a lot of pressure, and one may never want to be misrepresented in a situation like that. Okay, so as we talk about representation, as we talk about what is the stake of a survivor, let's also think about long-term change. How can we serve the survivors' best interests and also represent them properly? One of the most crucial things that we as activists found out was terminology, the language, the way we speak, the way we express ourselves in public, the way we speak to the survivors and then represent the survivors. So it starts with the smallest of things. For example, Sayo, as an entity, we have decided not to use the term female genital mutilation, but to use it as female genital cutting mutilation. Now, that said, as activists, we fully understand that this practice is 100% gender-based violence. It is no way condonable, but we want to speak to the community in order to initiate a dialogue. And that dialogue cannot be initiated if you are going up to the community and saying you mutilate your girls. Mutilation as a term may have been effective in the 90s when the movement gathered strength. But in today's day and age, and with more and more Asian communities coming to the forefront, or we finding out about the practices prevalence in more and more Asian communities, when we speak to them and they hear that when they hear the term mutilation for their practice, they simply don't agree with it. And so yeah, basically thinking about terminologies, thinking about more neutral terminologies, which would actually initiate a dialogue. I'm going to also speak about what are some of the other challenges here. We live in a world which is highly Islamophobic, and it is becoming more and more so with the drive of the right wing. Now, here's a report from the US, and the heading says, study, genital mutilation imposes segregation on immigrants' American daughters. Now, this has come out in the US, and who's to decide who is an immigrant, who's a migrant, who's a diaspora? Why are two heavily loaded words like immigrant, segregation, why are these words used to begin with in the headline? It will automatically, the headline automatically creates an environment of us versus them the moment you read it. Following which, if you look at the picture that follows, I don't know if it is a pure coincidence or it's supposed to be some kind of an irony. You see four girls who are raising hands, are all of brown or black descent, and the only girl who's not raising her hand is a white girl in the background. And this juxtaposed with the headline, genital mutilation imposes segregation on immigrants' American daughters. Now, what is this? Isn't this image clearly speaking of a certain kind of divide? This is not just subconscious, this is right there in your face. And this is happening in an environment which is becoming more and more Islamophobic more than ever. Now, this is another report which came out recently, and just by the visual of it, red, black, stop torture, disgusting barbarism of female genital mutilation is not religious freedom. I mean, it's hard to miss the tone of this article. You don't even need to read what follows to understand what kind of tone this article is going to take. In no way is it upholding any journalistic ethics of neutrality to begin with. Second of all, in its very introduction, it has touched upon a very sensitive subject, which is religious freedom of minorities. Now, this is not something which can be simply debated within a paradigm of, it cannot be seen in segregation. It is different in India, it is different in US, and religious freedom of a minority population in a majority scenario, that's something which is, it's a very charged and sensitive subject on its own. Associating that or coupling that up with keywords like disgusting, barbarism, female genital mutilation, the article, even before it begins, has already taken a stand. And one can clearly see how that could be problematic in an environment where suspicion against migrant communities, diaspora communities is highly on the rise. Okay, so now back to Arifa, who's going to present some facts.
So I want to talk about how journalists can focus on reporting with accuracy. So we've already spoken about approach towards journalism, not using sensationalism, not using a certain negative biased outlook. But then there are also just outright factual inaccuracies that affect reports on female genital cutting. One common thing that reporters and coverage on female genital cutting tends to get wrong is the terms for anatomy. So because you have to talk about cutting of the genitals, often reporters tend to get the terms wrong. So sometimes reporters will the report will just say refer to it as cutting of the vagina, which is completely inaccurate because the vagina is not cut at all during female genital cutting in none of the types. But then it's also important to realize that there are at least 4 different types of female genital cutting according to the World Health Organization's categorization. So when you are describing a particular survivor's experience of female genital cutting, and you're talking about if she belongs to one particular community and had a particular experience, you have to be careful as a reporter about accurately describing what was cut in her case. Did she experience a type of cutting that involved cutting just the clitoral hood, or was it clitoral hood and clitoris? Was it clitoris and labia? If it was labia, was it inner labia, outer labia? All of those terms need to be described correctly, especially in the case of the Bora community, where they claim that they are cutting only a part of the clitoral hood, but then many girls experience actual cutting of the clitoris as well. So then you have to write about that difference between these organs, and it's good to have that nuance in your articles so that it does not generalize. Similarly, a lot of reports tend to describe a survivor's experience of khatna in very general terms, or in very sweeping terms, as if just conflating it with the experiences of other people in other communities and countries. So often we see in the context of Boras as I showed you in that example earlier, where a quote was used from Waris Diri's experience in as a Somali woman who probably underwent a more severe form of FGC, and conflating it with my experience as a Bora woman in India. And even though our experiences were completely different, the report made it sound like it was all the same. So that generalizing description is it's a factual inaccuracy that needs to be corrected. Similarly, uh, what many media reports tend to get wrong is describing the medical and health consequences of female genital cutting. So again, how the cut impacts a woman's health, whether it is her physical, psychological, or sexual health, uh, the degree of impact will depend on the degree of the cut, how severely she was cut. And there are 4 types of cut. So it is inaccurate to describe uh, somebody who may have been through type 1 FGC, which is cutting off the clitoral hood and maybe a little bit of the clitoris. It would be inaccurate to say, oh, in this community, like female genital cutting, it impacts, it can have consequences like, death during childbirth. That does not happen in type 1. So type 1, 2, 3, they all have different types of health consequences in the short term and long term. And it's important to describe that difference and not to confuse one with the other. So, and I also wanted to stress the second point that I was making earlier about the need to not, generalize a woman's experience of khatna. It's really important to recognize that khatna is not experienced in a uniform manner by all Boras, or for that matter, by all women from any community. And if you misrepresent that, the report will end up alienating a Bora, any other Bora women who have experienced khatna in a different or less traumatic manner. So to sum up this general point, I just want to say that we need to remember that female genital cutting is a really complex, sort of nuanced subject, and it has a cultural aspect, a religious aspect, a legal aspect, a medical aspect. Uh, it can be written about from the child's rights perspective, or a gender violence perspective, or just simply the survivor's perspective. So all of these things need to be kept in mind while talking about female genital cutting. And I'm going to let Priya talk about the importance of the kind of visuals that are chosen.
Thank you, Alpha. Thank you for talking about different kinds of inaccuracies that one can go wrong with. So not just the words, sometimes the visual can also be factually incorrect. We will come to that in a second, but before that, I want to share this visual with you, the one that you see right now. It's a woman with a blade, a woman who's possibly wearing a rida, the traditional Bori outfit. And this was the main visual of a national daily, one of the most popular national dailies in India. And imagine having this on the front page. And these kind of visuals can be a trigger for the people who have undergone any sort of trauma. Like we hear about, how certain keywords or certain visuals are a trigger for other kinds of trauma survivors of different forms of gender-based violence. Even a visual of a blade and blood and a woman holding it, this can also be a trigger. And I understand as a filmmaker and as a visualizer that there is a dearth of how to represent something like this visually. But through the example that we have in front of us, on the left, there is a knife and blood and a woman symbol being cut. And on the right, the word literally says the cut, but it's not the same. And it's more subtle, it's not graphic, it's saying the exact same thing. And in fact, if you look at it symbolically, the way the H and the U of the cut is, it actually symbolizes the female anatomy. And it's done in a smart way without being a trigger or a shock to anyone who sees it first. So, yeah, I mean, even while using symbols like knife, blade, one can think of smart, innovative ways to depict it without making it gory. Something that Arifa earlier touched upon. These days on social media, we see a lot of macros, we see a lot of graphic design on, let's say, female genital cutting, and then there is a little bit of visual, and there's some text. So there's one which came out 2 years ago where there's a blade right between the female genitalia, and then the text says, during childbirth, being cut can cause real risk for both baby and the mother. Now, we're talking about a community which circumcises their daughters. And as Arifa pointed out when she spoke about different types of cut in the female anatomy, I mean, this is a community which removes the clitoral hood or maybe a little bit of the clitoris. How can this lead to real risk during childbirth? It doesn't lead to any sort of real risk during childbirth. So, I mean, thinking about how to mix up text with visuals, that's another thing to think of. Is it being factually represented or not? And then the biggest challenge of all, which is as even as activists, as storytellers writing on the subject, we do face a real dearth of pictures. And then you do a quick search on Google Photos and you come across a photo bank and you pick up the first picture you see from the photo bank without realizing that this doesn't represent the community. For example, the picture above. This particular visual, I think both Arifa and I would agree, we would have seen this on innumerable articles on Khatna in India. And it is absolutely appalling that this is not even, the people in the photo are not from India. This is Khatna in Indonesia. And this is done by a photographer who covered Khatna in Indonesia. So geographical inaccuracy like this, and then talking about, how Khatna in India needs to be addressed and the community needs to change this practice. The first impression the community would have is that this is not even speaking to me because this doesn't represent me. This picture does not speak to me. Then more such visuals of Khatna in Indonesia and that being equated with Khatna in India. And the other thing to think of is I don't think any of these pictures takes the survivor's privacy in mind at all. I mean, it's shocking and upsetting enough to see that screaming baby. I'm sure the photographer did not have the consent of the baby. Maybe she had consent of the photographers. So what do? We take into account that we are only using accurate visuals of the Bohra community if we are reporting about the Bohra community, not Indonesian, not African, not any other visual that we find on a Google search. But as we turn to the visual bank of photos from, let's say, the Bohra community, the two examples here on this slide, as you can see, these are pictures of women. These probably are stock pictures from some news agency. And these are pictures of celebration. And these are real women. So imagine them looking at their, their photo suddenly in that manner. Just one second. I think this video played on its own. Yeah, imagine them looking at their own photo out of the blue in a newspaper. So yeah, I mean, when we pick up stock photos of the Bohra community, let's just also keep in mind, let's not take any photos of a person whose consent we have not taken. Of course, many women would not be comfortable speaking about this, and many women would not be comfortable speaking up about this with their faces on. So that is something that we have to respect. What is the impact of a wrongly factually incorrect article, what kind of impact does an article like that have? In our experience, the first thing that we come across is a distancing. So instantly the community would say that article has got everything wrong. It's not uh, right. They've got it wrong. It's not the same as what is done in Africa. Because invariably the article might have a picture from an African community or some terminologies mixed up. Then they would say things like, this is not even a Bora in the picture, which they are very right in pointing out. And then the third thing is media slash they could be activists, they could be people who are speaking up about this, are trying to slander our community. And this is a far more complicated position to find oneself in, especially as activists, because our goal is to start a conversation and initiate a debate. You don't want to find yourself in a position where you are being told that you're trying to slander someone. And if the media's intention is to create a dialogue and stir change, then this is something to think about. Okay, so enough of do's, don'ts, wrongs. How about Arifa, you tell us some good positive examples?
Yep, thank you, Priya. I'm going to show you some examples on these slides of positive and well-written and well-represented reports on female genital cutting. So to begin with, there's this report from the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and if you see, the headline says, India urged to ban FGM as women break silence on secret ritual. The focus in the headline is on showcasing the empowering aspect of what is happening. The fact that women are breaking silence on this ritual, there's change happening, and the visual, the photos that's published along with it has women who are accurately depicting the women from the same community that it's talking about, the Bora women. And if you see in the next slide, the text of the report also begins on a note of empowerment. It's talking about how women who are survivors of the practice, who are now taking charge of the situation and are urging the government to ban the ritual. So there's a sense of agency given to the women. It's empowering, and it also this article also hints makes a mention of how this whole problem has been assumed to be an African problem, but it's not really, and that it can have serious psychological and physical problems. And so it's and the whole report avoids all kinds of judgmental language of the kind that we spoke earlier. And another aspect of this article was that it talks about not just the physical impact of FGC on women, but also the psychological trauma and the psychological impact that it has. And it puts this local news of FGC in the Dawoodi Bora community in India in the global perspective as well. So it's a really well-rounded, very accurately written report. After that, there's just this other report, which I think you can immediately look at the visual and guess that I'm going to make this point. Again, it accurately depicts Bora women from the community, the correct community that the article is talking about. But it also shows the women anonymously without showing their faces, and yet in an empowering way, like they're riding a scooter and going off somewhere. So there's a lot of layers to that photo that is quite, powerful. And the headline is also sensitively worded. It says the yin wounded.
I just have one anecdote here. And this is literally my most favorite anecdote. This article is the reason why I am associated with the movement of against FGC. because I read this article in 2011, and this was such a well-worded, sensitively written article. All the sources were anonymous. That the first thing that hit me was, imagine being in a situation where you cannot even give out your name and put out a quote. So even without sensationalizing, even without giving out names, not regarding someone's privacy, even without, like, subtly, this article had a tremendous impact on me and my psychology, and I decided to make a film about it. So yeah, I mean, just one article can be a start of a lot of conversation
Yeah.
there.
And yeah, and I just also wanted to talk about these other couple of news reports that have very sort of hopeful and a positive focus in their headlines. So both these headlines, if you read them, majority of nations where female genital mutilation is exercised want it to be stopped. Or UNICEF says most people oppose female genital mutilation. So the focus in these headlines is on the fact that now communities are demanding change. They're opposing the practice. So the more you focus on the change, the more the reader's outlook is going to change. That is quite important to remember. And the another best practice with respect to photos. Do you want to talk about this, Priya? The good
Sure.
photos that can be used.
Sure, sure. This was a campaign that Sayo did, which was "I'm a Bora and I'm against the practice," and you can see, I mean, just from the sheer variety of photos that we got, these are all, um, people like you, like me, like all of us, and it's so empowering to see their faces and them holding a message. This is not a picture from a victim. This is a picture from not even a survivor, is somebody who has a strong message to give. And those are the kind of progressive change heralding photos that we want to urge the journalists and photographers and bloggers to go after. And also, I would like to say, backbone of, and Arifa can second me on that, that a backbone of a good article or a piece, visual or otherwise, is good research. It's important, as Arifa earlier mentioned in one of her points, that we stress on how much we have moved forward. So, if there are people who are doing this practice, there are people who are opposing this practice as well. So in one of the surveys that Sayo did in 2015 with about 400 respondents, we found out that 81% of the people were not willing to continue the practice. And that is great. Just the sheer number out of 400 people that we spoke to, 81% said that they are not okay with the practice. They want the practice to end. So if a headline or a news report brings out that aspect of it, a reader might be able to see the problem and also see the movement, things changing within the problem. And this would also be a great starting point of a conversation within the community, because the community is also reading the report, and the community is also probably thinking about it in the head. Who are the people who want it to stop? Maybe it's time for them to also think about it like that. So, on that note, thank you for participation. We hope you had some takeaways from this presentation. If you have any questions, please write to us at info@sayo, Priya@sayo, Arifa @sayo. You can also write to Lara at communications@sayo. And
.com.
yes, .com. Info@sayo.com, Priya@sayo.com, Arifa@sayo.com. And yeah, probably we will be sending you some feedback on what we can do better next time. What would you like to hear more about? So yeah, thank you for your participation. I'm just going to stop the recording now.
Is there a sound coming, like some disturbance?
Yeah, I can hear the disturbance. I'm not able to end the recording. Shall we just end this call and
Yeah.
yeah? Okay. Thank you, Lara. Okay. Speak to you soon, guys. Disconnecting this call.
Thank you. Take care.